Welcome to the History Maps podcast. So, the wind howling off Mount Silpius in January 1098 carries the smell of rotting pack animals, unwashed bodies, and just pervasive disease.
Yeah, and you have men who once held these massive estates in northern France, and they are currently huddled in a flooded encampment, reduced to boiling the leather of their own shoes just to stave off starvation.
Right. They are trapped outside the impenetrable walls of Antioch, freezing, exhausted, and dying by the hundreds. And they're there because they genuinely believe the creator of the universe specifically commanded them to undertake this journey.
Exactly.
For this deep dive, we are going to dissect the First Crusade. We were looking at the years 1095 to 1099. And the mission today is to really pull apart the primary sources, so the Gesta Francorum and Acomnena's Alexiad, the decrees of the papacy, to figure out how this geopolitical and logistical nightmare actually functioned.
Which is so important because we need to get away from the simplistic narrative
Of just a holy war erupting out of nowhere.
Right. For you listening, we're dispensing entirely with that. We are going to examine the granular mechanical realities of 11th century warfare, theology, and economics that brought tens of thousands of Europeans to that starving camp in Syria.
So to understand how those men ended up eating leather outside Antioch, we have to look at the conditions of the late 11th century.
Yeah, we have to discard the idea that the First Crusade was a singular event. It was really the violent intersection of two distinct, highly complex regional crises that just happened to reach their breaking point simultaneously.
Okay, two crises.
Right. We are looking at a structural collapse in the East and a demographic overflow in the West.
Let us isolate that Eastern collapse first. Because if we look at the Byzantine Empire around the mid-11th century, on paper, it appears to be the undisputed heavyweight of the Mediterranean.
It does, yeah.
Constantinople is heavily fortified, immensely wealthy, and theoretically commands vast armies. Yet within a few decades, they are begging for foreign mercenaries. How does a structural collapse of that magnitude happen so rapidly? I mean, is it a purely military failure, or is there an economic rot underneath it?
It's a systemic failure triggered by a very specific military catastrophe. So we have to look at the Battle of Manzikert, which took place on August 26, 1071, near Lake Van in eastern Anatolia. The Byzantine Emperor, Romanos IV Diogenes, marched out with this massive force to confront the Seljuk Turks.
Commanded by Sultan Alp Arslan, right?
Yes. And the Byzantine army was massive.
The sources indicate it was perhaps 40,000 strong, but it was highly fractured.
Extremely fractured. It was a composite force of native troops, foreign mercenaries, and, crucially, political rivals.
Which is never a great mix for a cohesive battle line.
No, and that internal friction proved fatal. During the battle, the Byzantine center was pushed forward, engaging the highly mobile Seljuk horse archers.
Who fight very differently than the Byzantines are used to.
Right, and when Romanos ordered a tactical withdrawal as evening approached, the order was misunderstood or maybe deliberately ignored by some units.
Deliberately ignored.
Yeah, because a prominent Byzantine commander, Andronicos Doukas, who happened to be a political rival of the emperor, he commanded the rear guard. When the center began to falter, Doukas simply abandoned the field.
He just left.
He took a massive portion of the reserves with him.
So he essentially orchestrated a military defeat to achieve a domestic political assassination.
That's exactly what it was. Romanos IV was captured on the battlefield.
And the sources say he was eventually ransomed, but then his political enemies blinded and exiled him upon his return.
Yeah, it was brutal. But the true catastrophe of Manzikert was not the loss of the emperor, it was the loss of Anatolia.
Because following the battle, that centralized defense network just shattered.
Completely shattered. Over the next decade, nomadic Turkish tribes poured across the Anatolian plateau.
And Anatolia was not just a geographic buffer zone, right? It was the absolute economic engine of the Byzantine state. This ties directly into the thematic system.
Exactly. The Byzantine military and economy relied heavily on the themata, or themes. These were administrative districts where land was granted to farmers in exchange for hereditary military service.
So it provided the empire with a self-sustaining tax base and a highly motivated native militia.
Right, but when the Seljuks overran Anatolia, they didn't just take territory, they dismantled that entire thematic system.
Taking away land takes away the soldiers.
Exactly. By 1080, the Byzantines had lost up to 80% of their Anatolian landmass. Even Nicaea, a city perilously close to Constantinople, fell.
So the economic hollow-out is complete. Constantinople is deprived of its tax revenue, its agricultural heartland, and its recruitment pool.
They are essentially reduced to hiding behind the Theodosian walls, entirely dependent on hiring expensive foreign mercenaries that they can, frankly, no longer afford.
That is the situation Emperor Alexios I Komnenos inherits when he takes the throne in 1081. He is managing an empire on life support.
He really is.
I want to leave Alexios managing that crisis for a moment and shift our focus to Western Europe, because the crisis in the West is fundamentally different.
It's almost the exact opposite.
Right. The Byzantine Empire is imploding under external pressure and a loss of land. Western Europe is exploding from internal pressure and a surplus of people.
Yeah, the demographics of Western Europe in the late 11th century are undergoing this radical shift. Following the dissolution of the Carolingian Empire in the 9th century, centralized state power essentially vanished.
You have kings, like Philip I of France, but their actual authority extends barely beyond their own immediate estates.
Exactly. Power is entirely decentralized. It's held by local dukes, counts, and castellans.
And this political fragmentation collides with a massive agricultural boom.
Yes. We see the widespread adoption of the heavy plow, which can turn the dense, wet clay soils of northern Europe much more effectively.
And the three-field crop rotation system as well.
Right, so the caloric output of Europe spikes, and consequently, the population surges. But the societal structures governing land ownership are entirely rigid.
Because land is the only true source of wealth.
Exactly. And it is governed by the strict custom of primogeniture.
This is the mechanism where the eldest son inherits the entire estate. The titles, the revenue streams, literally everything.
Which leaves the second, third, and fourth sons with absolutely nothing.
And these younger sons are born into the nobility. They are raised from childhood to be professional, heavily armored cavalrymen.
They possess the training, the weapons, and the war horses, but they possess no land to generate income.
So if we map out the consequences of that, you have thousands of highly trained, heavily armed men with no economic prospects and no centralized authority to restrain them.
Yeah, and they inevitably turn to extortion, banditry, and endless internal warfare, just fighting over the same static pool of resources.
It creates a deeply violent, highly localized state of perpetual warfare. You could compare it to a pressure cooker without a release valve.
That's a perfect analogy. Yeah. And the Catholic Church recognized this internal rot. Pope Gregory VII initiated a series of sweeping changes known as the Gregorian Reforms.
The papacy sought to centralize its own power, wresting control of church appointments away from secular lords, a conflict we call the investiture controversy.
Right. But on a local level, the church desperately needed to curb the rampant violence of this knightly class.
And they tried to legislate morality through movements like the Peace of God and the Truce of God. I have read the decrees from these synods, and they are highly specific.
Very specific.
They declare that you cannot kill a peasant, you cannot rob a merchant, and you cannot fight on Sundays, feast days, or during Lent.
They attempted to apply a theological band-aid to a deep socioeconomic wound. Telling a class of professional, impoverished warriors to stop fighting because of a calendar date is entirely ineffective without a police force to enforce it.
Right. So the violence continued.
It did.
So, returning to our initial setup, we have a Byzantine emperor desperate for military manpower he cannot source locally, and we have a Western European society overflowing with militarized manpower it cannot control.
And the connection between these two crises is forged in March 1095 at the Council of Piacenza. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sends a diplomatic mission to Pope Urban II.
Now, Alexios is pragmatic. He does not want a massive, uncontrolled ideological crusade.
Not at all. He makes a highly specific tactical request. He asks the Pope to encourage Western knights, perhaps a contingent of a few thousand heavy cavalry, to travel east, enter Byzantine service as mercenaries, and help him push the Seljuk frontier back.
The envoys do mention the harassment of Christian pilgrims journeying to Jerusalem, right?
They do, but primarily as a rhetorical device to solicit Western sympathy.
Alexios is looking for a targeted, manageable mercenary force. But Urban II takes that pragmatic request, digests it over the summer of 1095, and radically weaponizes it.
He recognizes an unprecedented opportunity. If Urban can organize a massive military expedition under papal authority, he bypasses the secular kings entirely.
He demonstrates the absolute supremacy of the church.
Exactly. He simultaneously aids the Eastern Christians and, crucially, he finds a way to export the toxic violence of the Western knightly class out of Europe.
Which brings us to a specific field in central France, the Council of Clermont. November 18th to the 28th, 1095.
Urban II is French by birth. He understands the nobility, he speaks their cultural language, and on November 27th, he delivers a sermon that permanently alters the geopolitical landscape.
The primary sources present a major challenge here, though.
Yeah.
We do not have a transcript of this speech. We do not have a papal bull recorded on that exact day dictating his words.
No, we don't. We are relying on chroniclers who wrote their accounts years later, often after the Crusade had successfully captured Jerusalem.
We relied heavily on writers like Fulcher of Chartres, Robert the Monk, Baldric of Dole, and Guibert of Nogent.
And while their specific phrasing varies, the structural architecture of the speech is really consistent across the accounts.
Urban begins by outlining a horrifying, though highly exaggerated, narrative of atrocities in the East. He details the desecration of altars, the torture of Christians, and the immediate threat to the Byzantine Empire.
He deliberately constructs an urgent, emotive crisis. But the brilliance of the speech lies in the solution he proposes. He calls upon the nobility of France to cease their petty internecine warfare.
He tells them to stop murdering each other over meager plots of land and instead direct their martial prowess toward a righteous cause.
Right. He calls for an armed pilgrimage to liberate the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem.
And he offers a theological mechanism that is entirely unprecedented, the plenary indulgence. This is a concept that requires careful unpacking because it is not merely a free pass to commit violence.
No, the mechanics of 11th century theology are crucial here. When a person confessed a sin, the eternal punishment damnation was forgiven by God through the priest. However, the temporal punishment, the debt of suffering owed for that sin, still had to be paid. This was typically achieved through penance, fasting, prayer, or giving alms.
And for a knight who has spent his entire adult life killing, extorting, and violating the teachings of the church, the accumulation of temporal punishment is vast. He is facing centuries in purgatory.
Exactly. So Urban declares that the physical hardship, the immense cost, and the sheer danger of undertaking this armed journey to Jerusalem will serve as a substitute for all required penance.
It is a total remission of temporal punishment for confessed sins.
Right.
Did Pope Urban II essentially create a theological loophole? He took the violent reality of the knightly class and rebranded it as an act of profound religious charity.
He fundamentally fused the concept of a holy war bellum sacrum with the penitential tradition of pilgrimage, and the reaction was instantaneous.
The chroniclers report the crowd chanting, Dies vult, God wills it.
Yes, and Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy immediately stepped forward to take the vow and was appointed the papal legate.
I want to look closely at the historiography here, because the motivations of the Crusaders have been relentlessly debated. For much of the 20th century, the Marxist or materialist historical framework was dominant.
Yeah, the materialist framework argued that ideology was merely a mask for economic reality. It suggested that the Crusaders were landless younger sons driven by greed, looking to conquer new territories in the East because they were shut out of the inheritance system in Europe.
It framed the movement as an early iteration of Western colonial expansion, driven purely by the prospect of plunder.
But the sources, specifically the financial ledgers and charters of the period, completely dismantle that theory. Modern Crusade historians, particularly Jonathan Riley Smith, have shifted the consensus entirely.
Riley Smith's research focused on the granular financial reality of taking the cross.
And crusading was an incredibly expensive undertaking. To outfit a single knight required a heavy war horse, replacement mounts, chainmail armor, weapons, pack animals, squires, and enough physical currency to purchase food for years.
The cost is estimated to be 4 to 5 times a knight's annual income.
Right. Therefore, it was not the landless, impoverished knights who formed the core of the armies. It was the landed nobility.
They had to mortgage their ancestral estates to local monasteries.
They sold their rights to collect tolls. They plunged their families into severe debt just to finance the journey.
If the goal is economic enrichment, mortgaging your highly profitable farm to walk 2,000 miles into a war zone with a massive casualty rate is a highly irrational strategy.
It is financially ruinous. Riley Smith argues that we must accept their stated religious motivations as genuine. They truly believe they were engaging in an act of profound, self-sacrificing devotion.
While some prominent leaders certainly harbored ambitions for political power, the overwhelming majority of the participants viewed this as a penitential exercise requiring voluntary impoverishment.
Exactly. And Urban II clearly understood the logistics involved. He set a departure date for August 1096. He wanted a highly structured, organized force of professional soldiers to leave after the harvest was collected.
He wanted an army.
Right, but the conceptual power of his message escaped his control. The idea of immediate spiritual salvation, combined with a total escape from the rigid feudal hierarchy, resonated deeply with the peasantry.
This brings us to a phenomenon that completely defied Urban's planning. The People's Crusade. We're talking about a mass migration of commoners launching themselves toward the Middle East months before the official armies were even mobilized.
The catalyst for this movement is a figure known as Peter the Hermit. He was a highly charismatic ascetic from Amiens. He rode a donkey, wore coarse clothing, and refused to eat bread or meat, living entirely on wine and fish.
And he claimed to possess a divine letter written by Christ himself, instructing him to preach the crusade.
Right.
I am looking at the socioeconomic conditions of northern France and Germany in early 1096. Peter is not preaching in a vacuum. He's preaching to a population that has just endured several consecutive years of catastrophic agricultural failure.
There was severe drought, widespread famine, and outbreaks of ergotism.
And ergotism is a horrific affliction.
It is. It's caused by consuming rye infected with a specific fungus.
Yeah.
It causes severe gangrene, burning sensations in the limbs, which they called St. Anthony's fire, and intense, terrifying hallucinations.
When you combine starvation, hallucinogenic disease, and the sudden preaching of a holy war promising salvation in a mystical city, you have the perfect conditions for mass millenarianism.
The populace genuinely believed the end of the world was imminent, and this apocalyptic anxiety was reinforced by celestial phenomena. Meteor showers, a lunar eclipse, and the aurora borealis were documented during this period.
To the medieval mind, these are direct signs from God.
Exactly. Peter the Hermit manages to harness this hysteria, amassing a disorganized mob estimated at 15,000 to 30,000 people. There are peasants, women, children, and a handful of minor knights, such as Walter Sans-Avoir.
It is crucial to note that this is not a cohesive military unit. It's a migration of desperate people, and the lack of discipline leads directly to some of the most horrific violence of the era, long before they ever leave Europe.
As this massive mob moves east through the Rhineland, a dark, deeply anti-Semitic logic takes hold among splinter groups. We have to look at the actions of figures like Count Amico of Flonheim.
Count Amico gathered his own force of crusaders in Germany. They adopted a twisted interpretation of the crusading ideal.
They argued that traveling thousands of miles to fight the Muslims was illogical when, in their view, the enemies of Christ, the Jewish communities, were living directly among them.
They completely disregarded the official teachings of the church regarding the protection of the Jewish people.
They did. Amico and his followers launched systematic, brutal pogroms against the Jewish populations in cities like Speyer, Worms, and Mainz.
The local bishops actually attempted to intervene. The Bishop of Mainz sheltered the Jewish community within his own palace.
But the mob simply besieged the bishop's palace, broke through the defenses, and massacred everyone inside. It was an act of extreme religious fanaticism coupled with blatant extortion, as the Crusaders also looted the victims' wealth to fund their journey.
It demonstrates how volatile and completely uncontrollable the crusading ideology became once it left the hands of the papacy.
Yeah, and the main body of the People's Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit, avoids the Rhineland massacres, but their journey is still an absolute logistical nightmare.
They are marching through Hungary and the Balkans, attempting to feed tens of thousands of people through a combination of purchasing food and outright pillaging the local countryside.
They frequently clash with local Byzantine garrisons over food supplies. By the time they arrive in Constantinople in August 1096, they are starving, disorganized, and deeply suspicious of the local authorities.
Which, you have to think about the tragic irony here. You have a mass of desperate people viewing every large city they approach as Jerusalem, completely unaware of the geography and military realities of the Levant. And imagine the reaction of Emperor Alexios.
Oh, he must have been stunned.
He formally requested 10,000 professional heavy cavalrymen. Instead, he looks over the walls of his capital and sees 30,000 starving, unruly peasants led by a monk on a donkey.
Alexios correctly assesses that this mob possesses zero military utility against the hardened Seljuk armies. His primary goal is to get them out of his capital before they strip the surrounding countryside bare.
So he ferries them across the Bosporus into Anatolia and gives Peter the Hermit explicit, firm advice. Set up camp, remain defensive, and wait for the professional Western armies to arrive.
But discipline is non-existent. The mob is entirely fractured.
Peter loses control.
Completely. The French and German contingents split. A group led by Walter Sanzavar begins raiding deep into Seljuk territory, completely ignoring the strategic reality. They capture a small fortress called Ziragordon.
Which prompts a swift professional response from the Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan I.
Kilij Arslan recognizes this is not a real army. He surrounds Ziragordon. The fortress lacks an internal water supply. After 8 days of extreme dehydration, the sources report men drinking the blood of their pack animals to survive. The Crusaders surrender and are massacred or enslaved.
When the news reaches the main Crusader camp at Civitas, the remaining peasants demand revenge. Against the advice of the few experienced soldiers among them, they march out blindly.
On October 21st, 1096, they march directly into a carefully prepared Seljuk ambush in a narrow wooded valley. The Battle of Civitas is not a battle, it is an execution.
The Turkish horse archers rain arrows down upon an unarmored, panicking mob.
The Crusaders rout immediately.
Tens of thousands are slaughtered. Peter the Hermit survives only because he had traveled back to Constantinople to beg Alexios for more supplies.
The total destruction of the People's Crusade has severe diplomatic consequences. It deeply prejudices Emperor Alexios. He views the Westerners as volatile, undisciplined, and entirely untrustworthy.
Which sets a highly tense stage because, just as the remnants of the People's Crusade are being wiped out, the actual professional armies envisioned by Pope Urban begin arriving at the gates of Constantinople.
Right. This is the Prince's Crusade. Beginning in late 1096, highly organized feudal armies led by the highest-ranking nobility of Western Europe converge on the Byzantine capital.
Let us establish the key leadership, because there is no single supreme commander, which becomes a massive problem later.
We have Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Loire-Lorraine, commanding a large force from the Rhineland. We have Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, the wealthiest and oldest of the leaders, commanding the southern French forces alongside the papal legate, Adhemar of Le Puy.
And crucially, we have Bohemond of Taranto. He commands the Norman forces from southern Italy.
Bohemond is perhaps the most tactically brilliant of the leaders, but his presence in Constantinople is highly problematic. Less than 15 years prior, Bohemond and his father, Robert Guiscard, had launched a massive invasion of the Byzantine Empire.
He had personally fought against Emperor Alexios.
Yes.
I'm looking closely at Anna Komnene's account in the Alexiad. She's the daughter of Emperor Alexios, writing decades later. Her physical description of Bohemond is fascinating.
It really is.
She describes him as tall, physically imposing, with a certain charm, but she emphasizes a fundamental, inherent deceitfulness.
Yeah.
She views him as a highly dangerous predator.
She projects the trauma of his later betrayals onto his physical appearance. But in the winter of 1096, Bohemond is playing a very careful diplomatic game.
Alexios demands that before he ferries these massive armies across the Bosporus, the leaders must swear 2 specific oaths. First, an oath of fealty, making them his vassals.
Right.
Second, an oath stipulating that any territory they capture which formerly belonged to the Byzantine Empire before the Seljuk invasions must be immediately returned to Byzantine control.
Alexios is attempting to utilize them exactly as he originally intended, as a mercenary force to recover his lost Anatolian provinces. The Western lords are deeply resistant. Swearing fealty to a foreign emperor violates their complex feudal obligations back home.
Godfrey of Bouillon outright refuses initially. He camps outside the city, and minor skirmishes break out between his forces and the Byzantine Imperial Guard before Alexios cuts off their supplies, forcing Godfrey to submit.
Raymond of Toulouse also resists. He claims his only lord is God, and he ultimately compromises by swearing an oath to simply respect the life and honor of the emperor, avoiding a direct vassalage pledge.
But Bohemond, the man who actually invaded the empire, swears the oath with zero hesitation.
Because Bohemond understands leverage. If I can draw a parallel to modern corporate maneuvering, Bohemond views this oath the way a predatory CEO views a merger agreement during a hostile takeover.
You sign the document to gain access to the infrastructure and the assets, knowing full well you possess the tactical capability to void the contract the moment it no longer serves your interests.
Exactly. Bohemond even attempts to negotiate a position as the supreme commander of the imperial forces in Asia, a request Alexios politely but firmly deflects.
The tension here is palpable, but they eventually swear the oaths, and Alexios begins moving them across the strait. This brings us to a massive structural gap in the historical record.
Yeah, this is a huge issue with the primary sources.
When you read the Gesta Francorum, which is an anonymous chronicle written by an ordinary knight embedded in Bohemond's army, the Byzantine Empire virtually disappears from the narrative the moment they cross the water.
The Gestaffrancorum creates a narrative of isolated Western heroism. But the logistical reality, meticulously reconstructed by historians like Marek Mishko, completely contradicts this. The First Crusade would not have survived the first month in Anatolia without the highly sophisticated logistical apparatus of the Byzantine state.
I mean, for you listening, consider the sheer logistics of moving 30,000 armed people across an ocean and a continent in the 11th century. We need to analyze the sheer math of this operation.
We are talking about 30 to 35,000 people, including roughly 5,000 heavily armored knights. And those knights require massive war horses.
The caloric requirements are staggering.
A single 11th century war horse requires roughly 20 pounds of forage and grain every single day just to maintain combat effectiveness. Multiply that by 5,000.
Then add the caloric needs of 30,000 humans, the pack mules and the oxen pulling the siege equipment.
You cannot simply forage that much food from the local countryside, especially after the Seljuks have deliberately scorched the earth ahead of your advance.
Exactly. Misheko details how Alexios ordered his military governors to stockpile vast quantities of grain, wine, and salted meat along the projected marching routes.
The Byzantines organized markets outside the Crusader camps, strictly regulating prices to prevent price gouging.
And the naval support is equally critical.
It is the lifeline of the entire expedition. As the Crusaders march along the coast, Byzantine naval squadrons trail them. When the Crusaders eventually reach northern Syria, the Byzantines establish a massive supply chain originating from the island of Cyprus.
Misheko estimates the tonnage required, right?
Yes. To prevent mass starvation during a siege, the Crusader army required at least one large 100-ton cargo vessel arriving at the port of St. Simeon every single day.
And the Byzantines coordinated this shipping, unloaded the massive cargo, and then managed the transport of those supplies up the Orontes River.
Using specialized shallow draft barges because wheeled transport was too slow over the ruined terrain.
It is an industrial-scale logistical operation orchestrated entirely by the Byzantine Empire.
And yet, as you noted, the Western chroniclers erase this effort. They do so deliberately. By the time these chronicles are written, the Crusaders have broken every oath they swore to Alexios.
They have kept the conquered cities for themselves.
To justify this massive diplomatic betrayal, they have to construct a retroactive narrative where Alexios is portrayed as a treacherous, unreliable ally who abandoned them. You cannot acknowledge that the man you betrayed is the only reason you survived.
Right. So let us trace the actual military campaign in Anatolia now that they are supplied. The first major objective is the city of Nicaea, the Seljuk capital, in May 1097.
The Siege of Nicaea is a textbook example of Byzantine Crusader cooperation. The Crusaders surround the city on land, while Alexios secretly transports small, shallow draft boats over land on rollers to blockade the city from the adjacent lake.
And Alexios secures the surrender of the city without allowing the Crusaders to sack it.
Which frustrates the Crusaders, who were denied the plunder, but it achieves the strategic objective. Nicaea is returned to Byzantine control, adhering to the oaths. The army then begins the grueling march across the Anatolian plateau.
And they divide their forces to ease the burden on foraging. Bohemond leads the vanguard, and Godfrey and Raymond follow a day behind. This division almost leads to disaster on July 1st, 1097, near Dorylaeum.
Sultan Kilij Arslan has gathered a massive coalition of Turkish forces. He intends to repeat the slaughter of Civitot. He ambushes Bohemond's vanguard at dawn.
The tactics here are totally alien to the Western Knights. They are accustomed to heavy cavalry charges, directly smashing into an opponent.
The Seljuks utilize light cavalry, riding in, firing massive volleys of arrows, and retreating before the knights can engage.
Bohemond orders his forces to hold a tightly packed defensive formation. He forbids anyone from breaking ranks to pursue the archers.
They endure hours of sustained arrow fire. The armor of the knights holds, but they are losing horses at an alarming rate, and the unarmored infantry are suffering heavy casualties.
But the discipline holds just long enough.
It does. By midday, the second contingent of the Crusader army, led by Godfrey and Raymond, arrives on the battlefield and strikes the Seljuk flank. Adhemar of Lopui maneuvers his forces behind the Seljuk positions.
Kilij Arslan is entirely caught off guard by the sheer size of the combined army.
His forces break and flee, abandoning their massive camp and treasury.
The victory at Dorylaeum shatters the Seljuk military capability in western Anatolia. But the march that follows is brutal.
It is a march through a scorched, arid landscape in the dead of summer. The sources recount men chewing on thorns to generate saliva. They lose hundreds of horses to dehydration, forcing knights to ride oxen or walk on foot carrying their heavy armor.
But they push through, eventually arriving in northern Syria in October 1097. And this brings us to the defining, agonizing crucible of the First Crusade, the Siege of Antioch.
Antioch is a fortress of staggering proportions. It was built by the Byzantines and recently captured by the Seljuks. It sits between the Orontes River to the north and the steep, rugged slopes of Mount Sulpius to the south.
The walls are massive, stretching for miles, climbing directly up the mountain, culminating in a citadel perched 1,000 feet above the city. The fortifications feature over 400 towers.
The city is commanded by a seasoned, highly capable Seljuk governor named Yagi Sayan. He has spent the months prior to the Crusaders' arrival stockpiling provisions.
Because the perimeter of Antioch is so immense, the Crusaders, even with 30,000 men, cannot establish a complete blockade.
The initial phase is a porous siege. Supplies and reinforcements can still slip in and out of the city through the mountain gates. The Crusaders are forced to endure a grinding war of attrition outside the walls.
And then the weather turns. The winter of 1097 descends upon the camp.
It is one of the wettest, coldest winters in the region's history. Torrential rains flood the camps, turning the ground into deep, freezing mud. The supply lines from the coast break down. The grain stockpiles rot.
The starvation document in the chronicles is absolute.
Men are eating the leather from their shields. They are boiling roots. Scurvy and dysentery tear through the crowded, unsanitary encampments. The chroniclers estimate that 1 in 5 Crusaders died of starvation or disease during this specific winter.
The psychological toll triggers mass desertions.
Even the most fervent believers break under these conditions. Peter the Hermit, the man who sparked the entire populist movement, attempts to slip away in the middle of the night.
He is hunted down by Bohemond's nephew, Tancred, and dragged back to the camp in disgrace, forced to publicly swear he will not desert again.
During this period of absolute desperation, a critical diplomatic rupture occurs. The Byzantine representative, General Tatikios, who had accompanied the crusade with a small contingent of imperial troops, departs the camp in February 1098.
Tatikios claims he is leaving to travel to Cyprus to organize more supplies. However, the political reality is that Bohemond of Taranto had been systematically isolating Tatikios.
Bohemond spread rumors among the Crusader leadership that Tatikios was conspiring with the Turks, and simultaneously whispered to Tatikios that the Western princes were plotting to assassinate him.
Bohemond forces Tatikios into an untenable position, ensuring his departure.
Because Bohemond wants Antioch for himself. The moment Tatikios leaves, Bohemond publicly denounces the Byzantine Empire. He argues that by abandoning the siege, the Byzantines have broken their obligations, completely nullifying the oaths the Crusaders swore in Constantinople.
Bohemond declares that whoever captures Antioch should keep it.
The other leaders, particularly Raymond of Toulouse, fiercely resist this power grab. But Bohemond holds a massive tactical advantage. He has already established a secret line of communication inside the city walls.
Bohemond's intelligence network targets a critical vulnerability in Yagi Sayan's defense. The governor commands a highly fractured populace. Antioch contains a large population of Greek, Syrian, and Armenian Christians who chafe under Seljuk rule.
And Bohemond locates an asset, a man named Firuz.
Firuz is described in the sources as an Armenian who had ostensibly converted to Islam, but maintained deep grievances against Yagi Sayan. Crucially, Firuz commands 3 towers on the southern wall of the city.
Bohemond negotiates a complete betrayal. He promises Firuz wealth and guaranteed safety in exchange for access.
After 7 months of agonizing, starving attrition, the siege is resolved through espionage. On the night of June 3, 1098, Bohemond initiates the plan.
A small strike team of roughly 60 Norman knights quietly approaches the base of the wall under the cover of darkness.
Firuz lowers a leather ladder from his tower. The knights scale the wall, silently assassinate the guards in the adjacent towers, and secure a foothold. They open a small postern gate, and the Crusader army, which had been waiting in silence, floods into the city.
The pent-up rage of a starving, traumatized army is unleashed. The sack of Antioch is horrific. The Crusaders massacre the Seljuk garrison and indiscriminately slaughter the city's inhabitants, Muslims and Christians alike, in the confusion of the night.
Yagi Sayan attempts to flee on horseback, but is thrown from his mount and later killed by local peasants.
By the morning of June 4th, the city is theirs. The banners of Bohemond fly from the towers. It is a moment of total triumph.
But the triumph evaporates instantly. The brutal pivot of Antioch is that the moment they secure the city, they go from being the besiegers to the besieged.
Because later that exact same day, the horizon darkens with the arrival of a massive Muslim relief army. Kerbogha, the powerful Atabeg of Mosul, has assembled a massive coalition force from across Mesopotamia and Syria.
He arrives at Antioch and immediately surrounds the city.
The Crusaders have spent 7 months trying to break into Antioch. Now they are trapped inside it. And they just massacred a city that contains absolutely no food.
The starvation they experienced outside the walls during the winter is amplified. They are trapped inside a heavily damaged city, surrounded by a vastly superior fresh military force. Morale collapses entirely.
Prominent knights, including Stephen of Blois, who had previously fled, see the arriving army and retreat all the way back to Anatolia, believing the crusade is doomed.
Men inside the city are literally lowering themselves over the walls by ropes at night, desperately trying to escape through the enemy lines. They are mocked in the chronicles as rope dancers.
The army is at the absolute limit of human endurance, and it is at this exact moment of total psychological collapse that the narrative of the Crusade introduces one of its most fiercely debated events.
The discovery of the Holy Lands. We need to introduce a peasant named Peter Bartholomew.
Peter Bartholomew approaches the leadership in mid-June with a wild claim. He states that he has been visited in his sleep by St. Andrew. The saint allegedly revealed that the Holy Lance, the physical spear used by a Roman centurion to pierce the side of Christ during the crucifixion, is buried directly beneath the stone floor of the Church of St. Peter, right there in Antioch.
From an analytical standpoint, the timing is incredibly convenient. I have to look at the reaction of the leadership. Bishop Adhemar, the papal legate, is deeply skeptical.
Adhemar is an educated theologian. He points out that the Church already claims to possess the authentic Holy Lance as a relic in Constantinople. He views Peter Bartholomew as a fraud.
But Count Raymond of Toulouse, who is locked in a bitter political rivalry with Bohemond, embraces the claim. Raymond sees an opportunity to assert his own authority by becoming the guardian of this massive relic.
On June 14th, they organize an excavation. 12 men, including Peter Bartholomew and Count Raymond, enter the Church of St. Peter. They lock the doors.
They dig through the stone floor and excavate a massive trench, digging from morning until dusk. They find absolutely nothing.
And then, just as they are about to give up, Peter Bartholomew himself strips down to his shirt, jumps down into the trench, digs in the mud, and miraculously pulls out a heavily rusted piece of iron.
He proclaims it is the head of the Holy Lance. Okay, let us dissect the mechanics of this miracle. Was this a piece of scrap metal he hid in his clothing? Was it an old Roman javelin head buried centuries earlier? Or was this a highly calculated psychological operation orchestrated by Raymond of Toulouse to inject fanaticism into a dying army?
From a historiographical perspective, the objective authenticity of the metal fragment is irrelevant. It is almost certainly a planted object or a piece of random debris. What matters entirely is the psychological utility of the event.
The rank-and-file soldiers believe it completely.
Absolutely. To a starving, terrified 11th century peasant or knight, this rusted iron is irrefutable, physical proof that the creator of the universe is actively intervening on their behalf. The despair vanishes overnight.
It is replaced by a terrifying, hysterical religious fervor. They suddenly believe they are invincible.
Armed with this fanaticism, the Crusader leadership organizes a final, desperate gamble. They decide to march out of the city and face Kerbogha in open battle.
But first, adhering to the complex rules of medieval diplomacy, they send an envoy to Kerbogha's camp. They send Peter the Hermit.
Which is an incredibly arrogant move. Peter the Hermit walks into the camp of a vastly superior military commander and offers an ultimatum.
Peter demands that Kerbogha abandon the siege and convert to Christianity. Alternatively, he offers to settle the dispute through a trial by combat between selected champions.
Kerbogha, commanding a massive coalition force, obviously rejects this completely out of hand. He dismisses Peter. But Kerbogha makes a critical tactical error. He is overconfident, and he commands a deeply fractured coalition.
The various emirs in his army distrust each other, and they deeply fear that if Kerbogha destroys the Crusaders, he will use that prestige to dominate Syria and annex their territories.
So, on the morning of June 28, 1098, the gates of Antioch open. The Crusader army marches out. But they do not charge wildly. Despite their starvation, Bohemond organizes them into 6 highly disciplined tactical divisions.
They form a tight, cohesive infantry and cavalry line. Raymond of Aguilers carries the Holy Lance at the front of the formation.
The chronicles describe them marching out in absolute silence, radiating an eerie, fanatical discipline. Kerbogha watches them deploy. He attempts standard Seljuk tactics. He orders his archers to shower the advancing lines with arrows.
He even orders his men to set fire to the dry scrub brush in front of the Crusaders to break their formation with smoke and flame.
But the Crusaders literally stamp out the fire and continue advancing without breaking ranks. They press the center of Kerbogha's line with immense ferocity.
The tactical pressure exposes the political fractures within the Muslim coalition. The Emir of Damascus, fearing Kerbogha's growing power, suddenly withdraws his forces from the battlefield.
A massive defection in the middle of a battle. Once the Emir of Damascus leaves, panic spreads. Other emirs follow suit. Kerbogha's massive army simply disintegrates.
They break ranks and flee in a complete rout. The Crusaders pursue them, capturing the massive baggage train and securing absolute victory.
It is a staggering tactical achievement. Against insurmountable odds, they break the siege. It guarantees the survival of the expedition.
But in the immediate aftermath, the geopolitical reality reasserts itself. Bishop Adhemar, the unifying spiritual leader, dies of typhus in August. Without him, the political rivalry between the leaders explodes.
Bohemond formally claims the Principality of Antioch for himself, permanently breaking his oath to Alexios and establishing the first major Crusader state. Raymond of Toulouse fiercely protests, but eventually realizes he lacks the support to dislodge Bohemond.
After months of delays, squabbling over territory, and allowing the army to recuperate, the rank-and-file soldiers essentially force the leaders to resume the march southward toward their ultimate objective.
And as they march through modern-day Lebanon and Israel in early 1099, they face surprisingly little organized resistance.
Because the regional Islamic powers are deeply divided, the Sunni Seljuks in the north are fighting the Shia Fatimid Caliphate in the south.
The Fatimids, based in Egypt, had actually recently captured Jerusalem from the Seljuks, capitalizing on the chaos caused by the Crusaders.
So the Fatimids initially tried to negotiate a partition of Syria with the Crusaders.
But the Crusaders reject all treaties. Their goal is absolute control of the Holy Sepulchre. In June 1099, 3 long, brutal years after leaving their homes in Europe, the surviving remnants of the First Crusade finally arrive before the walls of Jerusalem.
The attrition rate is staggering. From an initial force of perhaps 35,000 professional soldiers and countless civilians, only about 12 to 15,000 remain to lay siege to the city.
The defense of Jerusalem is commanded by the Fatimid governor, Iftikhar al-Dawla. He is a highly competent commander. He prepares for the siege meticulously.
He expels the entire Christian population from the city to prevent a betrayal similar to Antioch. He poisons all the wells and cisterns outside the city walls to deny the Crusaders water, and he destroys the surrounding orchards to deny them timber for siege engines.
The Crusaders launch a desperate siege under the brutal July sun. They are dying of thirst, drinking putrid water from distant puddles. They realize they cannot starve the city out. A massive Fatimid relief army is already marching from Egypt.
They have to storm the walls.
But they lack the timber to build siege towers. Salvation arrives in the form of a Genoese fleet that docks at the port of Jaffa.
The Crusaders march to the coast, dismantle the Genoese ships, and carry the massive timbers miles inland to Jerusalem.
Using the salvaged wood, they construct 2 massive rolling wooden siege towers. They cover the timber with freshly flayed animal hides to protect them from the Greek fire and incendiary arrows launched by the defenders.
On the night of July 13th, Godfrey of Bouillon executes a brilliant tactical maneuver. He physically dismantles his massive siege tower, moves it under the cover of darkness to a weaker section of the northern wall, and rebuilds it before dawn.
It completely blindsides the defenders. On the morning of July 15th, 1099, Godfrey's forces push the tower against the wall. A knight named Lethold of Tournai is the first to leap across the wooden bridge onto the battlements.
The defenses are breached. The Crusaders pour into the city.
What follows is one of the most thoroughly documented and horrifying massacres of the medieval period. The Crusaders, fueled by years of unimaginable trauma, extreme religious fanaticism, and the brutal tactical norms of 11th century siege warfare, unleash absolute carnage.
The contemporary chronicles, written by the Crusaders themselves, do not hide this. They boast about it.
They systematically slaughter the inhabitants. The Jewish community flees to their central synagogue, seeking sanctuary. The Crusaders barricade the doors and burn the building to the ground, killing everyone inside.
The Muslim defenders and civilians retreat to the Temple Mount, seeking refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Tancred initially promises them safety and gives them his banner, but the following morning, other Crusader forces ignore the banner, break into the mosque, and massacre everyone.
The anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum writes that the blood flowed up to the ankles of their horses. While this is a deliberate apocalyptic literary trope referencing the Book of Revelation, the archaeological and historical consensus confirms a massacre of thousands of non-combatants.
It is a devastating geopolitical irony. Urban II launched this expedition citing the need to protect the holy sites and ensure safe passage for pilgrims. The manifestation of that order is an indiscriminate bloodbath that fundamentally traumatizes the region.
It permanently alters the demographic and spiritual geography of Jerusalem. The Crusaders immediately begin repurposing the sacred architecture.
The Al-Aqsa Mosque is converted into a royal palace and eventually becomes the headquarters for the Knights Templar. The Dome of the Rock, which they mistakenly believe is the original Temple of Solomon, is converted into a Catholic church called the Templum Domini.
With the city secured, the massive coalition of leaders has to establish a functional government. They hold a council on July 22nd to elect a ruler.
The crown is initially offered to Raymond of Toulouse.
But Raymond refuses. He claims he cannot wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ wore a crown of thorns.
That is the pious excuse he offers. The political reality is that Raymond knows he has alienated too many of the other leaders during the march. He knows he lacks the broad coalition required to rule effectively, and he hopes that by refusing, the council will beg him to accept it.
They do not beg him. They immediately offer it to Godfrey of Bouillon instead.
Godfrey accepts the leadership, but he adopts a highly specific, politically astute title. He refuses the title of king, instead taking the title Advocatus Sancti Sepulchre, the defender of the Holy Sepulchre.
This satisfies the clergy who believe the church should directly rule Jerusalem, while granting Godfrey the secular executive power to defend the territory.
And he needs that power immediately, because the Fatimid relief army arrives from Egypt just weeks later.
Godfrey demonstrates exceptional tactical aggression. Rather than waiting behind the walls of Jerusalem, he marches the Crusader army to the coast and launches a surprise attack on the Fatimid encampment at the Battle of Ascalon on August 12th.
They catch the Egyptian forces completely unprepared. The Fatimid army is routed, securing the survival of the newly conquered territory. Ascalon effectively marks the end of the First Crusade.
The vast majority of the surviving knights, believing their penitential vows are fulfilled, pack up and endure the long journey back to Europe.
But a fraction remains behind to govern what becomes the Crusader states: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli.
If we synthesize the operational mechanics of this 4-year expedition, it is an absolute logistical anomaly. Against staggering odds, a fractured multinational coalition marched thousands of miles, survived starvation, defeated multiple imperial armies, and captured their objective.
But the geopolitical blowback is immense, vast. It permanently shatters any hope of reconciling the Latin Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Emperor Alexios realizes the Westerners are not allies. They are rival imperialists who stole his territory.
More critically, the establishment of these aggressively expansive Latin states, built on the trauma of the Jerusalem massacre, slowly forces the deeply fractured Islamic world to unify.
It plants the seeds for a massive, organized counter-crusade that will define the region for centuries under leaders like Zengi, Nur ad-Din, and eventually Saladin.
As we conclude this deep dive, pulling back from the minutiae of siege towers and theological loopholes, what is the fundamental takeaway you want to leave the listener with?
I want to challenge the listener to reevaluate how we categorize historical conflict. In popular historical memory, the First Crusade is often framed as an inevitable ideological clash of civilizations. But when you dissect the primary sources, the ideology is simply a veneer.
The actual mechanics of the crusade were driven by highly specific, granular crises: agricultural failure, the restrictive inheritance laws of primogeniture, a Byzantine thematic system collapsing under nomadic pressure, and a pope seeking administrative dominance.
It asks us to consider a deeply uncomfortable question. How much of what we historically label as holy war, a war mandated by divine will, is actually just the byproduct of severe socioeconomic displacement, utilizing theology as a highly convenient, politically acceptable mechanism for expansion?
We return to the premise we established at the beginning. When you interrogate the primary sources, the clean narrative of divine intervention completely evaporates. You are left with the gritty reality of forged relics, Byzantine logistics, mass starvation, and desperate men boiling leather outside the walls of Antioch. The historical machinery is never as clean or as holy as the chroniclers want us to believe. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.